Our guest tonight is someone that you and I know pretty well. His name is Paul James. He's our development director at the Knoxville History Project, and he's also director of publishing. He's kind of the managing editor of our book series. But that doesn't even describe all he does with us. He's his You may know that his for some years he was executive director at Iams Nature Center, and I think it was that period that fomented his interest, keen interest in the history of conservationism, and especially in the founding of the Smoky Mountains National Park. And he is the office expert on that subject now. He knows more about the founding of the park than I do, and especially all the interesting personalities involved. He's written some books. He wrote a book about Iams Nature Center, and a book about Brockway Crouch, a florist who is also a conservationist. But he's these two guys that he's written about here, Iams and Brockway Crouch, both knew another guy that we'll be talking about tonight. Paul, among his other talents, is also kind of our staff photographer. He is, if you have any of our books, especially the last couple, the Knoxville, the Curious Visitor's Guide, and the Bearden book, which came out just a few months ago. A lot of the pictures in both those books were taken very modestly by Paul James. So he has an appreciation of photography, and he's going to be talking tonight about a photographer, probably the most prolific photographer in Knoxville history, thanks to his hard work and his pretty long life in his name. But he was also a conservationist and a key figure in the Smoky Mountains National Park movement, as Paul will describe. His name was Jim Thompson, and we thank Daniel Johnson, our sponsor for this evening. And anybody that wants to sponsor a future talk, let us know. But with no further ado, I will turn the floor over to my good friend and colleague Paul James. Paul.
Thank you, Jack. It's a pleasure to be running the slides and also doing the talking tonight. And thanks everyone for zooming in. Little pressure tonight because there are some people called with the last name Thompson in the crowd. I'm looking at you, Jim, at least. Welcome. Good to see you. And a number of people that may know more about the Smokies in real life than I do. It's people in the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club who have written about the Smokies. So I welcome you, and I welcome everyone who's been with us before and who is just coming to us, joining us for the first time. As Jack said, we are the Knoxville History Project, and our mission is to research and promote the history and culture of Knoxville. Something we do every day, and we look forward to it. Like Jack says, we do publications and private research and all kinds of things. And if you're interested in watching this talk again, or sharing with somebody, or looking at some of the other talks that we've done, they are available online on the Knoxville History Project or knoxvillehistoryproject.org in our portal. You see that there, and it's currently they're under podcasts and dialogues. Also, we encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about the history and culture of Knoxville, is maybe to pick up a book through the Knoxville History Project website or a local shop. Our latest is Historic Bearden up on the left there, but our bestseller is by far the Historic Knoxville Curious Visitor's Guide. That is, I guess it's into its third year right now. But we've got a bunch of books, a couple that Jack wrote on his own before or even during working for the Knoxville History Project, including the Old City that you can see there. We have some postcards and historical playing cards. And the talk tonight that I'm giving is based on an article or story I wrote for our recent publication, which is Knoxville Lives 2, second volume. These are story collections. We've done, I think, 7 of them since 2017, and we put one out every year. Our friends, the Knoxville History Project, who donate, has put together new stories that Jack and I write. Jack is our main writer, but also guest writers like Laura Still, who's been one of our speakers and is with us tonight, and also Eric Dawson with the Tennessee Archive of Moving Images and Sound. But Knoxville Lives 2 just came out, I guess, in early December, and that's where this Jim Thompson story is in. And also we encourage you, if you want to support Knoxville history in community of Knoxville and helping us perpetuate what we do every day. We appreciate either becoming a supporter or putting a few dollars in our tip jar if you're just discovering us for the first time. I particularly want to thank Daniel Johnson. Just met him yesterday, but he is our sponsor for tonight's talk. And Daniel has a special interest because he lives near where Wick Springs used to be, the resort. And we chose this photograph that Daniel loves from the McClung Historical Collection. So thanks again, Daniel, for supporting us tonight and helping us on our way. So tonight's talk, The Photographic Conservationist, The Surprising Legacy of Jim Thompson. I want to thank Jack for helping with the title there. But, you know, Jim Thompson is a name that if you're delved into Knoxville history, you will probably be familiar with. I guess I did discover it when I did my research for the Imes family about a decade ago, but a fascinating individual. And it's just, we are so blessed as a community that we can still enjoy the many thousands of examples of his work going back, you know, into just barely into the late 1800s. Quite a few people have written about Jim Thompson over the last decade. Found that in the research that a lot of newspaper articles largely covered the same story. Some people went in greater depth. Great writers, you know, Jim Tumblin, good friend of the History Project, did a really great article. I'm thankful for all of them. But we try to dig a little deeper for this Knoxville Lives 2 story. So we're going to be looking at the life and the things that Jim Thompson did, quite a few photographs that he took, and more than obviously we could include in the story that I wrote for the booklet. But and also we are definitely be remiss if we didn't go into the Smokies with him. So he'll be coming with us there as well. So I think it's fair to say that Jim was very talented. Not was only an artist as a photographer, but he was also a great businessman, I guess, an entrepreneur, if that term was ever even thought of back then, I'm not sure, but and maybe he was fairly lucky in terms of the time that he was active when Knoxville was growing as a fast manufacturing base, and a lot of people wanted photographs, and he was available and wanted to take them. So we will get going with the story and life and work of Jim Thompson. Want to highlight just for a moment his family. Jim Edward Thompson was born in Morristown, not far from Knoxville, in 1880. But his mother and father are interested and really probably deserve some research into more of their lives. But Charles Mortimer Thompson was born just before the Civil War in Morristown. He went by the name of Mortimer. He moved to Knoxville as a young man, and he was a budding artist, and he studied in the studio of our well-known and respected professional artist, Lloyd Branson. But he was also a writer and a musician, and he actually served as band leader in Nashville in 1896, when the state celebrated its first centennial. He was also served time as a draftsman, as well as an interior decorator. But really, what we know most about him is that in 1910, he was hired by Mayor Samuel Highskull to serve as the building inspector for the city of Knoxville, where he helped produce some of the first building ordinances for the city. And he also was continuing to painting and painted several of the mayoral portraits. That's the story that Jack and I have done with the city in the last couple of years. But these are just two examples that bear his name, and you could see these on the 5th floor at the City County building. On the left is Mayor John Brooks, and on the right is Mayor John McMillan, who was mayor from 1516 to 1919. It was the mayor of through Knoxville's troubled period with the riots that we've covered last year. But anyway, a lot of people still in history books have fond memories of Mortimer Thompson, and really was a person, as his father of Jim, that really inspired him to become the photographer that we know him to be. And Jim's mother is also an interesting lady, again, born before the Civil War, but in the late 1800s, was really was inspired by people like Lizzie Crozer French as a social activist. And in the early part of, in the 1900s and leading up to about 1911, she lobbied the city to take on the position of matron for the city police force, Knoxville police force, which had been vacant because it was unfunded for a few years. And they let her do that, but she did not get paid for a couple of years. In her own words, she felt that she looked after the unfortunates that fell into the hands of the police. And one of the things that she was very proud of was helping build a modest workhouse that was, I think it was out near Corrigan in East Knox County. She said it was not a palace, but she claimed that they saved 16 souls that first year, saving from women from prostitution and other vices, or even being forced into it, which was many the case. But when the Thompson family moved to Knoxville, when Jim was just 2 years old in 1882, they actually lived in a fairly interesting old frame house. And this is a picture of it, and right in the late 1800s. And many of you a little test quiz for you. Can you recognize it? I'll give you like 5 seconds, but it is now our only house or only building that has national landmark status. And we know it today as Blunt Mansion. You can see right in the middle here, that's probably a very early gas lamp. And on the corner here, which is right behind where the Andrew Johnson building or the Andrew Johnson Hotel previously was part of the old Bell School, I believe. So it looks very different today. But anyway, that was an interesting place for the Thompson family to go and live in when they came to Knoxville. So Jim, as a young man, as I said, his father introduced him to photography, and particularly because his father really specialized in his training in perspective. And he would use these glass photographic plates to project images on the wall and kind of draw around them and stuff, and for canvases in painting. And Jim was particularly fascinated by that. But he did leave school at a very young age. He actually went and lived and worked in Chattanooga for a short time. But as a young man, he was really fascinated by photography and experimented in a makeshift dark room in their house on East Cumberland Avenue, which I guess would be somewhere in the vicinity of the Civic Coliseum that we know today. But even as a teenager, he was getting becoming a reputation as a budding photographer of some note. And when he was 17, a pivotal event occurred in Knoxville that really kind of solidified his trajectory as a photographer. Early in the morning of April the 8th, 1897, so this is when Jim was just 17, a fire was discovered in the elevator shaft in the very early morning at the Hotel Knox on Gay Street. That was right about in the middle of the 400 block. So if you were on Gay Street today, looking at the Woodruff building and the Phoenix building, and also more towards the north or to your left would be Mass General Store. That's kind of about where the Hotel Knox was. And the fire raged rapidly through the building, the hotel, and just spread like wildfire to the surrounding buildings. And the city was a little under-equipped to deal with it. They did put a call to Chattanooga. At least one fire engine was put on the rail and sent up north to Knoxville to help extinguish the fire. And it was very destructive. And in actual fact, it was called the $1 Million Fire in actuality, but really the damage to those buildings was far greater than that. But these are just some early photographs that Jim took. This photograph, those fellas on the left there, building just to the left really would be what we would know today as Embassy Suites or the former East Tennessee National Bank, looking down to Gay and the intersection at Union, to the Sanford and Chamberlain Albers drug building there. And that was the one building that was really saved the fire spreading. But these are a couple of other photographs that Jim Thompson took, and that was part of the Thompson photograph collection in the McClung Historical Collection. And this is looking on Gay Street again, just down on the street there, looking down towards what we would know as Summit Hill. And again, just the devastation of those buildings. It was pretty incredible. And so these are one of the kind of first things that he got noted for as a photographer. And today, it's just they're just wonderful photographs, and just the extent of the damage and the buildings behind them on what we would know today, or that was back then, as State Street. But earlier, just even within just a couple of years, really, Jim was starting to get into business. He was kind of an apprentice for O.C. Wiley, which even then had a regional reputation as a leading manufacturer and dealer in optical goods. And this is where Jim worked on West Church Street, just a bit further down from where we were a few minutes ago, in 1904. And he rose through the ranks and enhanced his technical skills there, and combined with his critical eye and natural talents and abundance of patience, he began to develop into a gifted photographer, and he ended up rising through the ranks there and becoming head of Wiley's picture department. In 1903, this is actually Jack used this photograph in his old city book. He photographed this fellow on the left, or in the middle there, in the white with the bow tie, called Cowan Rogers, who was a sportsman and college grad turned inventor, who was working developing, kind of these prototype automobiles for a local bike company called Biddle Manufacturing Company. And this was about when he was just about to take off on an almost 10-hour run all the way down to Chattanooga, which took 9 hours and 40 minutes. So this is one of the little stories that Jack has told, and we have at the Knoxville History Project. Just fascinating things. You never think about people building prototype automobiles, even before the Model T was done in the early 20th century. But the next year, 1904, Jim again was asked by the local newspapers. This was still a time, if you look back at the early newspapers, you don't see many photographs in the 1800s. They really didn't. I guess it was coming in maybe 1910 or around about that loose time frame. Started to see more and more photographs in local newspapers. The newspapers didn't have full-time photographers. They were largely using freelance, but he was asked to go out to what we now know was dubbed the Newmarket train wreck in 1904. Two trains, one leaving from the southern station in Knoxville, collided with another one heading west near Market, a few miles from Knoxville, and it was a horrendous spectacle when Jim arrived, as well as other photographs. This is not a Jim Thompson photograph. I have not been able to find any, even though Jim took thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. Sometimes there's still not specific photographs that you're looking for, but McClung collection does have others. Sadly, 60 people did die in that terrible tragedy, and many more undoubtedly got injured. But the photographs that Jim took were placed in a shop on Gay Street, and that did develop his further reputation as a fine photographer. So this is one of his earlier, this is 1909 now, but this is Jim Thompson's kind of calling card or ad in the local newspaper. You can see here that he's still at 310 West Clinch with Wiley. So he's still working for Wiley at this point, but still now getting a reputation as a man in his businesses himself. As I said in the introduction, I think that Jim was extremely talented and he was very hardworking. And I think he saw the opportunity, and he was savvy enough to recognize that Knoxville at that time was growing fast. Between 1900 and 1905, growth in manufacturing in Knoxville was tremendous. And according to the newspaper reports, in 1907, Knoxville merchants were mailing between 40,000 and 50,000 mailers to their regional clients. And a lot of these products, or all these products, needed illustrating. They needed photographing. And Thompson was there and ready to oblige. He described what he thought was a need for a new style of photography in the thriving industrial center. And he could see the future demand for photography increasing. And he was right there at the time, willing and had the skills and had the sense to be able to grow his business. He moved from his home there, was living on Temperate Street at the time, to a new place. But this is another business card, which I kind of find fascinating, or ad. It just speaks to the tremendous different types of subjects that he was photographing and was willing to photograph. You've got chickens there and fowl, which we'll come back to in a minute. You've got dogs, typewriters. Down here on the bottom, you've got the Tennessee Mantle Company. He was already at the early part of the century already photographing mantles for C.B. Atkins Company. He just was willing and able to photograph all kinds of different things. But it was chickens that did cause him a little problem. Like I say, he would photograph anything, but this was a time when flash powder was used, and before flash bulbs really that we would know, but Thompson said that a lot of people were afraid of it. And one of his customers asked him to photograph their brown leghorn chickens, but was disappointed with Jim's results. Jim figured out that the flare was scaring them, and the flash rather was scaring them, but and also to kind of help them focus and be kind of contained in the shot, that he decided to film them at night. But the customer claimed that the chickens had a blank look and was not too happy. So I'm sure this was probably a later photograph, but the chickens did thwart him a little bit. The flash also, the new flash or the flash powder also caused some problems at the Bijou Theatre. This photograph is a little later, probably in the 20s, but or late 20s. But he was there in 1909. He was using this flash powder again, and there was a problem with it, and it exploded, and he got a shard of metal in his face and was bleeding right in front of the crowd. But the backstage crew were able to lower the curtain down and kind of avert everyone seeing it. But you know, again, this is the Bijou Theatre a little bit later, but just we've got some really great examples of some of the photographs that Jim or people in his company were able to take. Just really become iconic images. So kind of staying with iconic images a moment. In 1910, he took this photograph, as you can see in the local newspaper, of the Appalachian Exposition main building. It was one of our first of 3 expositions that are very famous in Knoxville's history. And this is a postcard that was put in production not too long after. And even though this is promoting the 3rd of the expositions in 1913, the Knoxville Exhibition 1, you can see that it's turned a photograph that was in the newspaper into probably a best-selling postcard. But if you do go back and newspapers.com, that Jack and I really enjoy looking at old stuff in there. These are just some examples of other photographs that he took. People have been fond of saying that Jim took the firsts of many things, and that may be true. We don't always have pictorial evidence of it, but this is one that he took in 1911 of this daring aviator who was record-breaking flights coming down at the exposition. This is one of Colonel Roosevelt. This would have been after Roosevelt would have been president in 1910. That's when Taft was president, coming here to the exposition grounds. And just like a little fun one here with this little boy in this chariot that was part of this New Sentinel. It was like it was a little competition or something. One of the things that I've discovered is that, you know, just Jim Thompson took photographs of a vast array of different subjects throughout his career, which is a very, very long career. As I was saying, in about 1912, he set up a new studio on Lowry Street. Lowry Street does not exist today, but it would be in the vicinity of the Civic Coliseum, just east of downtown. And that's where his base was for many decades. But during the 19-teens, one of the things that Thompson's company was very proud of was that they could photograph anything. They would make enlargements. They would do hand tints. At one point, he had about 30 people working for them, but also that they would assist developers, people in business, kind of keep track, kind of progress reports, if you will, keep track of sometimes very complicated construction projects, including this next one. Get ahead of myself a second, but this next one in 1919, what here we're looking at down at the corner of, the 100 block rather, of Gay Street, right today where it intersects with Jackson. This is the raising of the Gay Street in 1919, and as if you could see at the top of the corner there, Gay Street Viaduct progress photograph. This is one of the projects that we talked about last year, because, well, 2 years ago now, actually, time moves fast, doesn't it? It's the 100th anniversary, just beyond anyway, and focus has obviously been on this part of town just recently. Is the first ramp, which has been renovated, has been open. Back to the previous slide, this is just an example of a newspaper report in 1927, just really talking about, again, the vast array of different things that Jim and his hardworking and talented crew was able to photograph. Jim was also fond of just, you know, helping people get photographs, and would would charge people to take photographs of their family and family portraits, even though that wasn't something that he personally liked doing himself. But one of the things that he talked about later in his career was taking photographs of the soda jerks. I didn't have one of the soda fountain indoors at Coleman's where he was talking about, but this is something similar. This is the inside of Newcomer's soda fountain in 1913. So Newcomers would be, again, on that 400 block of Gay Street. But this is just, this next shot is just a really wonderful photograph of Coleman's drugstore. And this is what he had to say about it in 1970 when he was interviewed. He said, "We didn't have wide angle back then. I had to back out into the street and block off the entrance to keep people from moving in and out. I don't see these things either. I had to set up my tripod and put flash powder in a pan. And I held it over my head, and when I pulled a trigger and sent a little alcohol flame into the powder, it would go boom. Of course, crowds gathered. Later, I didn't mind the crowds. It was good for business. But then I was shy and easily embarrassed." It's hard to imagine Jim, so pretty precocious, being embarrassed, but it must have been a little challenging to kind of be in the public frame initially in his career. And I just love this shot. Here's a little closer version coming in of the soda jerks and all the paraphernalia that was being shipped to Coleman's. And if you're wondering where this was, if you're familiar with the visitor center at Visit Knoxville on the corner of Gay Street and Summit, this is actually what we're looking at, that same block. You can see on the left the road going uphill. That would be what we know as going uphill on Summit Hill, up near where Jack and I are at Summit Hill, old Gallows Hill. This was in 1925. And just staying on Coleman's one extra moment, just for variety, here's a night shot that Jim took looking south down on Gay Street. It's just amazing, and just the wonderful photographs that it's still inspiring today that Jim took. 1919, back to 1919, Jim's younger brother, Robin, who had been stationed in the Quartermaster Corps at Camp Sevier in South Carolina, and then went up and spent 6 months at the U.S. School of Aerial Photography in Rochester, New York, and then came back and merged in business, joined his brother Jim in business. This is actually an article from when they did it again later in the 30s, but Robin definitely needs highlighting because he was an extremely talented photographer himself. In fact, when we get into the kind of the Smokies part of this story in a bit, sometimes it's very difficult to know when it just says Thompson photograph on a photograph or postcard. Did Robin take it? Did Jim take it? Both of them took a lot of photographs. But Robin particularly was really gifted with aerial photography. And here's one looking from South Knoxville down onto the city. As Jack mentioned in the Roaring Twenties talk that we did 2 or 3 weeks ago, Robin broke away from his brother. They had a falling out, I guess, of some degree, and in the 20s, and went into business on his own and set up just down the hill from here in the Daylight building. But they did get back together again as Thompson brothers in the 30s. And around about that time, really, the late 20s, when Robin went off on his own, Jim set up Snapshot first on Church Avenue, and then it moved around the corner in the early 30s to Gay Street, which would be pretty close to where the East Tennessee Historical Society is today, on that kind of western side of Gay Street near Church. And he got his son, Bert, who started running that. But over the next 50 years, Snapshot developed all across town. It had a place in Western Plaza in Beard, and also was in Oak Ridge, and much later in the 60s, early 70s, it even ventured across state lines into places like Kentucky. But in the early 30s, in this place on Snapshot, Jim and Bert, they had a home movie screening room on the mezzanine at the back of the shop, and also had a special sales room for Kodak cameras and supplies. And one of the things also that they displayed was Jim's photographs of the Smoky Mountains. So we're going to get into with Jim Thompson and the Smokies now. I'm not exactly sure when Jim's love affair with the Smokies began, but we do know that in about 1913 to 1915, he was venturing over to what most people in Knoxville would have called, the very rugged, remote mountains just beyond Knoxville. Most people at that time wouldn't have even dared thinking about going to the mountains unless, one, they were very plucky, I guess. They could get there, would have been probably a 2-day drive up to that point, or maybe they got the train to Elkmont or to Townsend. But we do know that Jim was photographing. He loved taking wildflowers in 1915, around about that time. He loved to photograph them for his mother, who couldn't make those kind of treks. But he started taking, what soon, within a decade, would be taking iconic images of the Great Smokies. Here's just a lovely one that I found at the University of Tennessee Library, and I do want to highlight where you can see in your own time some of these photographs in local collections. Is just phenomenal. But a decade later, in 1924, he was asked to be the resident official photographer for a new organization that had just started, called the Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association, a new organization that was dedicated to making the idea of a national park happen here in the eastern part of the US. It was led by a formidable guy called Colonel David Chapman, who was a wholesale druggist and also a veteran of the Spanish-American War, as well as a growing number of Knoxvillians, also including Willis Davis, who was the head of the Knoxville Iron Company, and also his wife, Annie, who went on to become the first elected woman in East Tennessee, became elected to the Tennessee state legislation a couple of years later, actually in 1925. But the Davises, as some of you may know, had been out to Yosemite and Yellowstone, places like that in 1923, and were just amazed by not only the rugged beauty, but also the opportunity and the comparisons of what they thought the rugged Smokies just beyond Knoxville had comparisons to. So if there could be amazing national parks out in the West, could we not have one in the East? And it seems like the Smokies had a lot of in favor going for it. So thus, at the end of 1923, the Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association was born. And again, Jim was asked to take photographs and was kind of sent off, probably under his own steam a lot of the time, to take photographs of remote places in the Smokies. I mean, remote, what even we think today might be remote, and there's just millions of people going there, but that's where Jim was doing this. And we'll look at a few more photographs in a minute, but just stepping back a little bit, Knoxvillians and the idea of the Smokies becoming a national park in the East, it wasn't just it wasn't an idea that was just in a vacuum. There was at least about 30 other places in the East that had the same idea at this time. And the government had convened this committee, the Southern Appalachian National Park Commission, to determine which were the best likely sites that a national park could be. And they whittled it down to about five sites, and the committee traveled down to as kind of far south as Alabama and North Georgia. And at that point, they were not really interested in the Smokies becoming considered. They were kind of, really encouraged by the Knoxville contingent really to pay attention to what they were saying. And so finally, they kind of wore them out a little bit, and they did agree that a contingent from Knoxville, led by Colonel Chapman, could meet with them in Asheville. This was like 30th of June, 1924. Well, Colonel David Chapman had this idea that, well, one thing that we can do, if we can't get him to the Smokies initially, let's send Jim Thompson with a whole bunch of photographs. And we don't know exactly which photographs Jim took there, and this is the Grove Park Inn in Asheville in 1924, but I would imagine that these kind of iconic photographs that Jim took would have been probably in his car. These were framed photographs. And, the committee had spent that day looking at Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina, and they were really excited about it. And when they came you're pretty tired after a long day's looking at Grandfather Mountain, some of them kind of felt, as Jim said kind of later, that they didn't know if some of Jim's photographs were real, which is kind of funny when you think almost a century later with fake news that they even consider such a thing. But they said, we love these fantastic photographs, but we want to see where these were taken. And these are just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 photographs of just what I consider kind of iconic early 1920s photographs that Jim took, that they got excited about. And the 2 members of that committee did come to the Smokies about a week or 2 later, and they were really, truly impressed of what the Smokies and the potential of the Smokies had to offer. And I guess in a way that you could say to some degree that the rest is history, but it just goes to show that, just to underscore the importance that Jim's talents and ability to go out and find these locations and take these amazing photographs were one of the pivotal instances and reasons why Knoxville was involved and successful, as well as North Carolina ultimately, in making the national park happen that we know and love today. So millions of people who visit the park, they really do have Jim Thompson and a lot of other Knoxvillians to thank. And back to kind of Knoxville Lives 2 and 3, or Knoxville Lives 3 that Jack and I are going to be doing again this year. You know, we are going to continue looking at these pivotal people like Colonel Chapman and Carlos Campbell and some others to really research their stories as well. But Jim Thompson was a founding member of the Smoky Mountains Hiking Club, which most of you will probably be somewhat familiar with. He was president at least once in 1928. He was making many trips in the 1920s with the hiking club and also on his own specifically to take photographs. So you may be wondering, you know, what kind of camera setup that Jim was using and how was he doing that? I'm not an expert on cameras, so you can bear with me a little bit on this, but he definitely enjoyed heaving his very heavy Eastman view camera, which weighed about 70 to 80 pounds. It had a bellows and a hood, probably very similar to this one on the left. And he was taking 8x10 or 7x5 glass plate or film negatives. You know, we have the luxury today when we take a photograph, you know, we can look into our digital viewfinder and see what we've got and get some rough idea if that photograph is going to be reasonable. But of course, he never had that. You know, these photographers of the day never had that luxury. They spent hours in some cases with Jim, waiting patiently, probably driving his companions crazy, just waiting for the right light and the right ambience to take these photographs. But he did have what was kind of called his porters, who were volunteer hiking members like Brockway Crouch, who Jack mentioned earlier, but also Carlos Campbell and others of the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club that lugged his heavy gear up for him and kind of drove themselves crazy waiting for him to take these photographs. But kind of put it into perspective, you know, Jack and I was talking about this a few weeks ago. You know, we know that you know, phenomenal photographers like Ansel Adams came to the Smokies in the late 40s or late 30s or early 40s. And, you know, even Adams himself admitted that it was devilish to take photographs sometimes at Cades Cove or in other valleys and on the mountains, because the light was very, very different from what you would get at Yosemite or out in the West. So even a true expert like Ansel Adams, you know, he struggled a little bit. He did admit, even though he took some great photographs in the Smokies, but it just goes to show, kind of explain a little bit of what Thompson was up against. Of course, you know, he inspired other people like Dutch Roth and Carlos Campbell themselves to get into photography, and they've left behind some wonderful albums and collections as well. Now, one of my favorite photographs that he helped compose, he did take it, his brother Robin, who we talked about a few minutes ago, took it, is this photograph on July the 19th of 1925. You know, whenever I take photographs, there's always somebody that's, you know, got their eyes closed or looking the other way. How did they compose some of these amazing photographs where everyone is completely, you know, is looking great and got all their eyes open and everything? But this is a very special photograph because it was the first visit really of members of the hiking club, but a bunch of other kind of hangers-on, if you will, to the first campsite that was established by this fellow with the axe, Paul Adams, in the middle to the right in 1925. And it's got a bunch of interesting photographs on it, including Thompson himself. He spent quite a few minutes composing this photograph for his brother Robin to take. It has Paul Adams. Paul Adams is probably is famous, if not less famous than his dog, which was Cumberland Jack, or when he was in the Smokies, called Smokies Jack. This was a trained police dog that he got in Knoxville. Paul was not from Knoxville, but he's considered Knoxvillian because he lived there for quite a while. His dog is actually right underneath the table. Jim really wanted the dog to come out and sit on the table, but he just wasn't having it. But we know he's there. Who else do we have? We have the Imes family clustered here. We have HP and Alice in the back and the 4 daughters there. Pretty somewhat rare for them to be in the photograph. Dutch Roth, I mentioned him again. Dutch, he was a fitter at the Costa Sharp Railway Yard in Knoxville, and he was a constant companion with Jim, not only helping him with equipment, but also taking his own photographs as well over time. And also Brockway Crouch, he wasn't a photographer, but he was another Knoxvillian that was a fellow explorer and a pioneer in the Smokies for trail building, and was a big part of the Smoky Mountains hiking club. Well, I've already mentioned the Imes family, but there you are again. So this is just a fantastic record of kind of Knoxvillians going out into the Smokies in the mid-1920s. One of the other things that I talked about in my article was who else was writing about the Smokies and who else was photographing it. We know that Jim Thompson, his photographs were used locally and also nationally. But in 1926, he did team up, or was asked by Horace Kephart to help him illustrate an article in this magazine called World's Work, which was a monthly magazine at the time. Of course, Horace Kephart is a very interesting fellow. He was a Harvard-educated man. He had abandoned his career as a librarian in excuse me, in the Mercantile Library in St. Louis after he'd had a breakdown, and he had purposely chose to relocate somewhere that would help in his recovery as a person, but also kind of can coincide with his strong interest in the kind of pioneer life that he chose to come and recuperate in the Smokies in like 1906, around about that time. But he's very famous for his book on our Southern Highlanders and also camping and woodcraft that he wrote. Interestingly enough, the photographer who did this expanded version of our Southern Highlanders, it was published in 1913, it was redone in the early 20s, was Professor Essery. He's a guy that really deserves some research on him as well. He took this photograph on the cover here on the left of one of the chimneys, but certainly he would have been a colleague, if you will, or of Jim Thompson's, who would have been photographing in the Smokies in 1915. But staying with Kephart though, Kephart asked Jim Thompson to illustrate this article that he did in 1926, and also work with him on the Appalachian Trail. Jim was extremely active in this idea that was born in the late 20s to help create this notion of an Appalachian Trail that went from North Georgia all the way up to Maine. And how would it happen? How would we bring it to fruition? And who would be engaged to get it to happen in the Smokies? And Jim particularly was very, he was encouraged to do it by a banker from Jonesboro, a fellow called Paul Fink, who was an early authority on the Smokies. And the route from Georgia to Maine was split into five districts. And in the Smokies section, Paul Fink and Jim Thompson and Horace Kephart were charged with establishing a transversable route and also energizing local hiking clubs to help make this happen. And this is Jim in action with one of those measuring wheels in the Smokies. Thompson was known because of all his constant forays into the Smokies. He had a really detailed knowledge of the history and the terrain of the Smokies, particularly on the Tennessee side, and of course on the North Carolina side. Horace Kephart was becoming an expert, having lived in that region for 20 years. And also assistant Kephart was another extremely talented photographer called George Marser. And it's interesting to highlight George, not only because he was a fantastic photographer in his own right, but of his connection to Kephart and also to Jim Thompson. He was born in Japan, immigrated to the US around about 1915. There's quite a mystery that still surrounds him. We don't know a lot about his early background, but if his photographs of the Smokies, they equal Thompson's, maybe they're even better. It's really up to you whether you think that. But regardless, we're very fortunate that we had at least two phenomenal photographers documenting the Smokies. Unfortunately, with Mesa, the number of photographs that exist today just is an extremely tiny percentage of what we have with Jim Thompson. So it's a shame for Mesa's legacy that didn't quite work out for him. And again, that's another story. But there are people like Bill Hart and Janet McHugh, who are with us tonight, that helped with George Ellison on some recent books, particularly with Kephart, and hopefully some new ones with George Mesa, as well as Paul Bonesteel, who did a really great documentary about 20 years ago on Mesa. But we know that Thompson and Mesa were communicating somewhat often with the Appalachian Trail efforts, but also on something else, and that was with the Smoky Mountains Nomenclature Committee beginning in 1929. Jim was appointed to it by Paul Fink. And this photograph is a little bit later. This is probably in the mid to late 30s. Jim Thompson on the left. Arthur Stupka, some of you may know, he was the first park ranger that hired in the Smokies in the 30s. In the back there, we have Carlos Campbell and also Brockway Crouch in the back on the right. The U.S. Geological Survey, again, under Colonel Chapman was involved, charged the committee with deciding the official names of the mountains, the names of the passes and streams and other points in the Smokies, to eliminate a duplication of names. You got to remember that when the Smokies was combined, with North Carolina, they, and making it available and traversable to tourists, that there was quite a crossover of duplication of names of places. And this particular part of this story are captured it in that recent book I was telling you about. It's actually called Back of Beyond, Horace Kephart biography. And it was wonderful to me to be able to see the kinds of things that Jim Thompson was involved in, just way beyond his photography. So, with his photography and his input on the nomenclature committee and the Appalachian Trail, he really has left a specific imprint on the Smokies. In a letter to Arno Camera, who was the associate director of the National Park Service back in the early 30s, Paul Fink, who was writing to him, praised Thompson for his dedication and hard work. And this is what he said. He said, Jim Thompson has done a monumental piece of work in transcribing every place name in the park area, arranging them alphabetically with locations so that we can decide on elimination, duplications, and unsuitable names and the like. And that was Paul Fink in 1931. Sadly, in 1931, Horace Kephart was tragically killed in a car accident near Bryson City. And sad as well that just within 2 short years, George Mesa got sick and sadly died. And on the second anniversary of Kephart's death, just before he died, Mesa had arranged for a hike in the Smokies, and there was over 100 people came to it, and Jim Thompson was one of those people that went to show his respects. So Thompson and Mesa and Kephart is kind of a nice triumvirate, a very talented men working together for the greater good. In 1940, when the Great Smokies was dedicated, Jim Thompson took some wonderful photographs, and here's kind of one of his famous ones. You've got to wonder about that litter there, but we will overlook that. But I wanted to just take the moment, to deviate slightly from the Smoky story and highlight something else that Jim Thompson was very well known for, and also very, very talented as well. And that was his films. I'm not going to show any films tonight. Maybe we could do that as a partnership with the Tennessee Archive of Moving Image and Sound. But Jim Thompson was there on Dedication Day in September 1940. Took some footage of that. Here it is with President Roosevelt. And also, one of the things that he was doing in the 20s, away from the Smokies, that he started filming UT football games. The mid-20s, I think it was like 1926, 1927, when General Neyland came here. he asked Thompson to come and start filming football games. And one of the things that Thompson is well renowned to do, as well as Nayland really to do this, was not only to get Jim Thompson to come and film the games, but also to set up his projector midweek so they could watch the plays and kind of learn how not only the Vols were playing, but also to kind of see when the next time they play their opponents, to learn some footage and, you know, learn the plays and all that. I know nothing about football, so I'll say no more about that. But these are just a couple of screenshots that you can access online pretty easily through the TAMIS website. In 1929, Tennessee versus Alabama was the earliest existing footage of what Jim Thompson took. And I don't know who they were playing in 1938 down the bottom right, but Thompson took the first color footage of the Vols. So maybe we'll revisit that kind of history another time. Oh, well, what about this slide? Again, here's Nayland and the Tennessee Vols in the 1920s, another kind of a great shot by Jim Thompson or Thompson brothers on the right. A couple of other photographs. This one I used in my story. This is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial that we were just seeing with President Roosevelt. Just a wonderful composition, a newfound gap there by Thompson. This is actually, this one's from the University of Tennessee Library digital collection. We'll come back to that in a minute. I want to end this section on the Smokies with a quote from Carlos Campbell, who was, you know, a great photographer in his own right, but he was certainly inspired to take photographs by his good friend, Jim Thompson. He said Thompson was a great Smokies enthusiast. He went into remote sections of the area, the Smokies, and brought back pictorial evidence of the charm and majesty that was later to be enjoyed firsthand by millions of people. It requires no stretch of one's imagination to realize that without the help of these magnificent views, there might have been no national park in the Great Smokies. Even though there was a lot of other people involved, definitely Jim Thompson certainly had a very special role to play. Well, again, a couple other things on the Smokies. That in 1937, Jim again expanded his business. He set up the Camera Center in Gatlinburg, and the store sold photographic prints and murals to a lot of tourists and also area merchants. One of the other things that his wife at the time, Emily, was one of the employed colorers or tinters who worked, you know, long hours on blow-ups of enlargements of a lot of the prints, and a lot of those enlargements were in. I think the last one I saw was at the Riverside Hotel in Gatlinburg, maybe about a decade ago. I think maybe that's now in the McClung collection, not on display, but. That was another side of the business, and unfortunately, it had to close down because the rents became too prohibitive as Gatlinburg in the 60s was starting to really grow into the 70s as well. But even you know, Jim lived a very long life. He was born in 1880. He died in 1976. He was almost 96 when he passed away. But he was very active. I'm not sure that he ever really retired. If he did, it was probably in the late 60s, early 70s. But he was recognized by his colleagues and his peers. He served as president for the Southeastern Photographers Association and president of the National Photographers Association in America. Many people have asked, what happened to the glass negatives? Well, those 8x10 glass negatives or the 5x7 glass negatives. Well, there's a bit of a mystery behind that. They're not here in Knoxville. Jim, I guess he was always ready to make a deal, and he sold them to a Knoxville lady for about $500, which presumably would have been a little bit of money back in the 60s. This lady, in turn, sold them to a fellow who hoped to get into business himself, but didn't quite have the equipment to really, you know, generate the really rich quality that Thompson was able to do. And then went to Puerto Rico, and we've lost track of him since then. So what happened to all those original negatives, we don't know. But in the late 1960s, early 70s, the head of then McClung collection, Polly Creekmore, had the idea and approached Jim to donate many of his photographs and other negatives as well. And we're extremely fortunate that with her hard work and tenacity, at least 35,000, if not more, prints and photographs were saved from that Lowry studio and were donated by Thompson to the McClung collection. Many have been shared or copied and now at UT collection, you know, digital collections. But that really kind of, you know, it kind of sums up Jim's legacy. he did pass away in 1976. He is buried in Highland Cemetery, kind of the far western part of the cemetery. It's we covered this, Jack and I, in our historic Bearden book. It just came out this summer, but a lot of famous people locally are buried up in Highland Cemetery, and it's a very interesting place to go and walk around. Again, kind of finish my talk tonight. We are very fortunate as a community that we have the photographs that Jim took. We're also extremely fortunate that we have collections and places that we can enjoy them for free every day, or to get permission to include in books. If you've never been to the Knoxville, to the McClung collection site, there are, I think there's like 9,000 Thompson photographs, Thompson brothers photographs on there. And even one of the things that, I spend a lot of my time with the History Project researching and searching for specific things, but you can just browse the photographs. Might be a bit intimidating to browse 9,000, but you probably could spread it out a little bit. But there's just an amazing diversity of photographs. And this is what Jack and I just stumbled upon yesterday. This was taken, I think, on Gay Street in 1907 as part of the temperance election that year. And we'd never seen this photograph before. And in the back, you can see there the Bijou Saloon. This is not outside the Bijou or the Lamar House. This was elsewhere, and we need to go to the city directories and look this up. But throughout his career, Jim has just taken amazing photographs of people, of street scenes, of buildings, of events, of automobiles, of circus parades. It really adds a complete richness to the stories that we tell at the History Project. If you're not familiar with the UT Library's digital collection, they have a vast number of photographs online and postcards, and I particularly want to highlight a couple of things. The Thompson Brothers photograph collection is wonderful. Here's one of my favorite photographs, or one of his tinted photographs. You may be familiar with this. This is along the Appalachian Trail, looking towards Charlie's Bunyan there in 1939. And also postcards from the Smoky Mountains. They're not all Thompsons, not all Jims and Robins, but again, you could lose a day or a year delving into these online collections that we have in Knoxville. Well, I think that's about wraps my talk up today on Jim Thompson. I again want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Daniel Johnson for sponsoring tonight's talk. I'll be happy to open up for questions, and Jack will help me if I get a little stuck on Knoxville history. So thank you. See if there's any particular questions. Someone was asking, when did color photography come about? Oh, that's a good one. Jack, do you have any idea on that? Color photography? Maybe more in the 20s, perhaps?
There were certainly experiments with it in the 20s, and I think they were tinting them before that. And I think it kind of was a gradual evolution.
Come to think of it, I know Jim Tanner, who was the expert on the Ivorybill woodpecker. We did some research on that at IAMS. He was using pretty exclusively black and white photography in the early to mid 30s, but did start moving over to color in the late 30s. So maybe that'll answer your question.
Paul, my dad was a photographer, and he did very little color because it was so drastically expensive. He had his own little black and white shop room in Holston Hills, but he did manage to send some off to get some Kodachrome slides made. So you'd have to send the film off and then hope they developed it right.
And what era was that, Bob?
This would have been in the late 1940s, early 1950s.
Could I put in something here, Paul?
Yes, Jim, how are you?
Good, thanks. Color came in experimentally a lot earlier. We have a nice image of my father at about the age of 6. He was born in 1904, and it's made through the Lumiere process. Lumiere brothers were famous photographers and cinematographers in France at the turn of the century. But color photography isn't that new, really. This was an unusual process that isn't used anymore, but the colors were quite vivid.
Well, thanks for adding to our education, Jim.
You bet.
If you don't know Jim, I want to introduce Jim. Jim is Jim Thompson's grandson.
That's right.
And I also forgot to mention, Jim's legacy is still going on because Thompson Photograph is still open for business down there on Middlebrook Pike. So if you need some enlargements, or they have some wonderful old photographs as well, you can look through a book and stop by someday.
Hey, Paul, somebody was asking if Elkmont was established around the time Thompson was taking pictures of the Smoky Mountains.
I'd say it was before then, really, probably in the very late 1890s, Jack, wasn't it? Or early 2000s, early 1900s.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, if you drive to Townsend, you'll see a date of like 1901 of when Townsend was, well, it was renamed. It used to be called Tang, but you know, that was a lumber community as Elkmont was. And if you drive between, you know, where the Y is between Townsend and Gatlinburg, you will follow the old railway, road, really, the old beds of the railway along the little river there. But yeah, Elkmont was, you know, was a lumber settlement. Yeah, way earlier than where Thompson was going to the Smokies, I would imagine.
I wonder if there's a repository of the George Mesa photographs.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think and maybe one of our friends on here can jump in and correct me, but I think the University of Western North Carolina has some. Is Janet around? Janet, could you answer that? Janet McHugh, who co-wrote the book on Horace Kephart. Thank you for joining us from New York State, Janet.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Yes, there's quite a nice collection at Western Carolina University. Also, the Great Smoky Mountains in their archive have a nice selection of Massa's photos as well.
There's a really wonderful, as I mentioned it earlier, but there's a wonderful documentary that Paul Bonesteel did about 20 years ago with George Marso, and you can get it out from the you know, McClung, the Knox County Public Library down at Lawson McGee, and I just watched it a few days ago. And you know, setback with Marsa, that a lot of his photographs seem to have gone missing. And again, the fortunate for us in Knoxville that a lot of Jim's have survived. And but combined, you know, we do get these kind of two different approaches and two different sides of the Smokies. So whenever you can save photographs and help with history, it's just so wonderful.
Did Thompson's wife join him and help him on the hikes to take pictures?
I don't have any evidence of that. Jim, you may know that Emily, his first wife, I can't remember his second wife's name, but
rarely. You know, they also occasionally summered in the Townsend area at some of those fine old hotels, and she did go with him there. But as far as hiking, she wasn't that much of a hiker.
Can I sign on here for a minute?
absolutely, please.
My question is, well, first, hi, Jimmy, and please give my regards to Ginger. But did Jimmy Thompson or Jim Thompson ever have any connection with Alfred Ox or Ed Westcott?
I am not familiar with those names. The Ox is not related.
Alfred Ox moved to Knoxville and started one of the primary Knoxville newspapers. And this was probably in the late 19th, early 20th century.
His son would have been Adolph Ox. Adolph Ox?
Yes.
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 Yeah.
And then he went to Chattanooga, started Chattanooga Times, and then
it was
New York Times.
Somewhat
But
earlier.
he was a contemporary of Jim. So I'm wondering what connection there was with him.
Not really. He was here. Adolph Fox lived here in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and
okay.
moved to Chattanooga in the 70s, and was still familiar with Knoxville. Came back to visit now and then, but that was before Jim Thompson's time. And Ed Westcott was a well-known photographer in Oak Ridge, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I lived next door to his granddaughter, in fact, but he was the primary photographer at the beginning of the Manhattan Project throughout it. And I can't help but think that he and Jim Thompson were buddies. I mean, I don't know, but
or rivals. I don't know, but they were both. I'm sure they were aware of each other. They were contemporaries. I think Ed Westcott, I think, was younger perhaps by a
Yes.
generation or so
Yes.
than Jim, but they were working at the same time. So
Yes.
yeah, they knew about each other, certainly.
Can I jump in for a minute?
Yes.
I will say that Jim Thompson's work in the Smokies continues to inspire the nature photography community, and that there are people who currently go out into the backcountry and attempt to photograph in current terms what Jim was photographing many decades ago, and kind of this is now and this is then kind of situation. Also, the work that's going on with Discover Life in America and Tremont and some of the other organizations depends heavily on photography. So that's kind of the current trends in conservation in the national park. I'm a volunteer photographer for the Smokies.
Okay.
So Jim Thompson is an inspiration to me. I grew up here in Knoxville, and so I look to some of what he did as inspiration for what I do now in the park. But our current efforts looking at conservation have taken a different turn, in that we're looking at the impact of the volume of visitation on the national park. The Park Service is currently undergoing a big data collection and public input process, looking at the impact of people, and photography is playing a huge role as we document what the visitor experience is now, and where and plan for what to do in the future. So we're continuing to use some of those same ideas of how can we use the lens to tell the story of the Smokies, very much as Jim did in his day.
That's
Wonderful to hear.
How hard is it to find a Jim Thompson photograph and say, I know exactly where this is and I'm going to go there and take a picture of the same place? That seems like it would be really challenging to me.
It is challenging, and I'm a terrible backcountry hiker, so I tend to stay to the places that are not as difficult to get to. But one of my colleagues, who also does volunteer photography for the park and is an avid backcountry hiker, his name is Bob Carr, has been working on a series of trying to look at what's in the collections, particularly the ones at UT, and then trying to find those places in the backcountry, and he has the ability to do that. Obviously, he's not hauling 70 pounds worth of camera gear with him. Another piece that's important is, the Friends of the Smokies is so critical to what happens in the park today. And, they got started with, Mount Cameron and White Rocks and trying to save the fire tower. And part of their early work involved photography. Very fine Knoxville photographer, Bruce McCamish, has taken amazing photos for Friends of the Smokies to use of that project. So it's still happening, but we all look to the source of those original photographers for inspiration.
One thing that Jim said, I think quite late in life, is that he didn't really consider himself a historian, but he has left amazing gems and a lot of value. It's historical records that, just they have a life long after that he took these photographs that are used in all kinds of ways. I never thought of that. That's great to hear. One of the things that, Jack and I really like and value is your input in these. After we do the talks, is that we encourage discussions and we learn new things about what's happening in Knoxville, or in the Smokies in this case. We did a community input survey a few weeks ago, and one of the things that people said that they liked is then and now. So I like your idea there of it's not just in Knoxville, it's also in the Smokies. These photographs have a lot of distinct value, understanding where we've been, where we're going. Someone asked also about, did Jim Thompson take wildlife photographs because he knew Harry Iams? I've not seen really many photographs of wildlife. There is a wonderful photograph of Harry Iams covered in like sparrowhawks, which I saw down at the Thompson Photograph store in Middlebrook Park. I'd never seen that photograph before. So someone has done extensive research in the Iams family. That was nice to see. One of the cute little stories that I did find out doing this research, kind of stumbled across really at UT Digital Collection, is that Smoky Mountain Hiking Club in the late 20s, really when Jim was the president of the hiking club, they used to have their annual meetings in Knoxville, and they had it at the Iams place. And that was, you know, they would have either driven out there or they would have taken the streetcar, you know, the streetcar that's the Island Home streetcar that's sitting in the East Tennessee Historical Society today on exhibit. But they did hold their meetings in the Magnolia Woodward Lodge, which is right where the castle is, the Williamswood Castle, if you know what I'm talking about, right next to Iams on the inlet there of the Tennessee River. And I've never seen inside that building until I discovered some photographs of Jim and a whole bunch of the members of the hiking club that Dutch Roth took. So there are gems out there waiting to be discovered. Sometimes they just happen in their own little time frame. So someone also asked about, do you know if there were other murals of the Smokies by Jim Thompson made into murals or wallpaper? Sounds like that maybe there was some at the Botanical Gardens. Been a long time since I've been in that building in the Botanical Gardens. I'll have to ask Jim, what's his name over there? Sorry, I do not know. If anyone here knows, Laura, do you know?
Yes, I do a tour of the Botanical Gardens, and I'm a member out there as well. So I do tours of that property, and there is a Jim Thompson mural inside the house where the visitor center is today. And supposedly that was done with his permission, made into a wallpaper for their dining room. And someone touched it up last in the 1950s, but it's not been touched since then. But it's a beautiful photograph. I think I'm not good enough on geography to identify what area of the Smokies it is, but it is a beautiful piece. And I don't know if he ever did it for other people, but he definitely did it that one time. And it's still available to look at. But the house, the visitor center is unfortunately closed because of the pandemic right now. But normally, hopefully they'll open up again in the spring and summer, and people will get to go inside the house and take a look at that mural. It's beautiful.
I do remember it now. Yeah, I appreciate. Thank you, Madeline Brand, for asking that question, and thank you, Laura, as well.
To that, relating to the murals, Jim was one of the pioneers in panoramic photography. He had a special camera that took a great long, wide negative that he was able to print, and a lot of the photographs that you see from Jim are those panoramic photographs, which was a huge risk in technology at the time. It was the forerunner of VR.
They have some on display. If you go down to Thompson's on Middlebrook, they have some on the wall there. And there is one at Iams, where it is, whether it's probably not on display, but they have a fantastic, it's like an 8-foot long, really thin panoramic of Meade's Quarry. It's fantastic. Yeah, it's
beautiful. It's sharp from one end to the other.
Oh yeah, yeah. I almost included it tonight, but it's so small on the screen. It is beautiful. It's about 270 degrees, if not more. I think it was a circuit panoramic camera. From memory. Again, I'm not an expert, but
I think you're correct.
Yeah. And I think Robin took some as well, I believe. But